Before humans learned how to speak, truth already existed. Cold was cold. Hunger was hunger. Darkness was not symbolic. It was real. And death did not need a story to justify itself. Nature did not explain itself. It did not comfort. It did not care whether humans understood it or not. Truth in its purest form was indifferent, but humans were not. From the very beginning, humans were fragile creatures, not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most resilient. What they had instead was awareness, and awareness came with a price. To see reality clearly was not a gift, it was a burden. The first human who truly understood the world did not feel enlightened. He felt afraid, because knowing meant realizing something terrifying. The world was not built for human comfort. It was not fair, it was not safe, and it did not promise survival. So the first conflict in human history was born, not between humans and nature, not between tribes, but between truth and the need to survive. Early humans did not ask, "Is this true?" They asked something far more practical. Will this help us live? Will this keep us together? Will this calm us or destroy us? And if a truth created fear, panic, or doubt, then that truth became dangerous. Not because it was false, but because it worked too well. A truth that frightened the group, threatened the group's survival, and survival always came first. Imagine a small prehistoric community with no walls, no technology, no certainty about tomorrow. Every individual depended on the group. To be alone was to die. Now imagine someone standing up and saying the hunt is too dangerous. The leader might be wrong. The storm will return. We are not protected. These statements may have been accurate, but accuracy did not matter. What mattered was their effect. Fear spreads faster than hunger. Doubt spreads faster than fire. And once fear entered the group, coordination collapsed. People hesitated, people questioned, people stopped following. And in a world where hesitation meant death, truth became a liability. This is where humanity made its first silent decision. Truth would no longer be judged by what it was, but by what it did. If truth stabilized the group, it was accepted. If truth destabilized the group, it was rejected, even if it was real, even if it was obvious, even if it was unavoidable. This was not cowardice, it was instinct, the instinct to protect the group at any cost. Humans did not need accurate explanations. They needed reassuring ones. They needed stories that made fear manageable, that turned chaos into order, that transformed uncertainty into destiny. This is where truth began to change shape, not erased, not destroyed, but softened, filtered, translated into something survivable. The first myths were not lies, they were compromises. They took terrifying realities and wrapped them in narrative. Lightning was no longer random destruction, it was intention. Death was no longer meaningless, it was purpose. Suffering was no longer arbitrary, it was deserved, chosen, or necessary. These stories did not remove danger, but they removed panic, and panic was the real enemy. From this moment on, human history followed a pattern. Truth was allowed only if it did not threaten cohesion, only if it did not isolate the individual, only if it did not challenge the structure that kept people alive. Those who crossed this invisible line were not seen as brave. They were seen as reckless, as destabilizers, as threats. This is why the first punishment in human history was not death. It was exile, to be separated from the group, to be cut off from protection, to face reality alone. Truth-tellers learned this lesson early. Being right did not save you. Being accepted did. And so humanity learned how to live around the truth instead of inside it. This video is not about heroes or villains. It is about a mechanism born before civilization, before religion, before philosophy. A mechanism that still governs us today. The instinct to silence dangerous truths in favor of comfortable stability. Because from the very beginning, truth was never harmless. It was never neutral, and it was never safe. Survival always came before understanding. For the first humans, knowledge was not a virtue, it was a risk. They did not live in a world where ideas could be explored safely. They lived in a world where a single mistake meant extinction. Every decision had consequences that could not be corrected later. There was no second chance. There was no room for abstract curiosity. When food was scarce and predators were near, the mind was not rewarded for questioning reality. It was rewarded for obeying it. The human brain did not evolve to seek truth. It evolved to avoid death, and death was everywhere. It waited in the dark. It waited in the cold. It waited in hunger. It waited in isolation. In such a world, information was valuable only if it directly increased the chances of survival. If a piece of knowledge did not help the group hunt better, move faster, hide more effectively, or stay united, it was useless, and useless knowledge was dangerous because it distracted attention from what truly mattered. Staying alive required coordination. Coordination required predictability. Predictability required shared behavior, and shared behavior required agreement, not debate. A group that debated reality too much did not last long. A group that hesitated died. A group that questioned every signal missed the moment to act. So early human communities unconsciously learned to prioritize certainty over accuracy. A wrong belief that everyone followed was safer than a correct observation that divided the group. If one person saw danger while others did not, that person became the problem. Not because the danger was unreal, but because the warning disrupted unity. The group did not ask whether the warning was true. They asked whether it would cause fear. Fear slowed people down. Fear broke formation. Fear caused individuals to act independently, and independence was fatal in a hostile environment. This is why survival instincts trained humans to suppress inconvenient knowledge. The mind learned to filter reality, not to understand it fully, but to keep it manageable. Any perception that overwhelmed the group was rejected. Any insight that questioned leadership was silenced. Any observation that suggested uncertainty was ignored. The leader did not need to be correct. The leader needed to be followed, because a flawed decision made together was safer than a perfect decision made alone. This principle became deeply embedded in human psychology. Trust the group. Silence doubt. Maintain cohesion. Survival demanded it. Knowledge that complicated action was treated as a threat. The individual who thought too much endangered everyone. The individual who questioned too much destabilized the structure that kept the group alive. So the group learned to punish excessive awareness. The punishment was not always violent. At first, it was subtle. Disapproval, suspicion, distance. But even that was enough. Because in early human life, distance meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. Over time, humans internalized this lesson. They learned to censor themselves before the group had to do it for them. They learned when not to speak. They learned which truths were acceptable and which ones were not. They learned that being observant was less important than being aligned. This was the moment when survival separated itself from understanding. The mind stopped asking what is true and started asking what keeps us alive. And this shift shaped everything that followed. It shaped language. It shaped belief. It shaped morality. It shaped culture. Knowledge was no longer pursued for its own sake. It was evaluated based on its social impact. Does it unite or divide? Does it calm or disturb? Does it reinforce order or challenge it? The answers to these questions mattered more than truth itself. This is why early human societies favored repetition over exploration, ritual over analysis, tradition over discovery, because repetition created stability. Stability created predictability, and predictability increased survival rates. A repeated error was safer than an untested truth. This is not because early humans were unintelligent. On the contrary, they were acutely aware of their fragility. They understood instinctively that knowing too much too fast could be fatal. They understood that the group could not afford constant reevaluation of reality. There was no margin for philosophical uncertainty. Only action mattered, and action required belief, not doubt. So belief systems began forming long before formal religion. They were not designed to explain the universe. They were designed to coordinate behavior. They told people where to go, when to act, what to fear, what not to question. And these systems worked. They kept groups together. They reduced hesitation. They minimized internal conflict. And as long as they worked, they were preserved, even if they were wrong, even if they were incomplete, even if they were illusions. Survival rewarded obedience, not insight. It rewarded conformity, not curiosity. It rewarded silence, not revelation. Fear existed before language, but it was silent. It lived in the body, not in the mind. It was a reflex, not a thought. The first humans felt fear when they heard a sound in the dark or saw movement in the bushes, but they did not explain it. They reacted, they ran, they hid, they survived. But the moment humans learned how to speak, fear changed its nature. It no longer stayed inside the individual. It became transferable. Once fear could be described, it could be shared. Once it could be shared, it could spread. And once it spread, it could reshape reality for the entire group. A single voice could now infect many minds. What was once an instinct became a narrative. Someone could say there is danger, and suddenly danger existed, even if it was not visible. This was a turning point in human history, because language did not only allow humans to communicate safety, it allowed them to communicate threat. And communicated threat was more powerful than any physical signal. Words could travel faster than predators. They could reach people who had not seen the danger. They could create images in the mind stronger than reality itself. When someone described a threat, others began to imagine it, and imagination amplified fear beyond what the senses alone could produce. A shadow seen by one became a monster, feared by all. This is when fear stopped being personal and became collective. And collective fear was far more dangerous than individual fear. An individual afraid might flee, but a group afraid might collapse. Fear, spoken aloud, disrupted coordination. It broke rhythm. It created hesitation, and hesitation was lethal. The moment someone questioned safety, the group slowed. The moment someone expressed doubt, trust weakened. The moment someone named fear, others began searching for it. Eyes moved away from the hunt and toward the unknown. Minds stopped focusing on action and started anticipating disaster. This is why early communities began to treat spoken fear as a threat in itself. Not all fear, but fear that could not be immediately resolved. Fear without a clear solution. Fear that lingered. Fear that questioned leadership or direction. Saying, "I am afraid," was one thing. Saying, "we might all die," was another. The first statement was human. The second was destabilizing. And so, language forced an impossible choice: silence fear and preserve unity, or allow fear to speak and risk fragmentation. The group learned quickly which option kept them alive. When fear spoke too freely, chaos followed. People argued, people doubted, people acted independently, and independence destroyed survival strategies built on cooperation. So fear had to be controlled, not eliminated, but managed. This management did not happen through reason. It happened through suppression. The group did not analyze fear. They contained it. They decided who was allowed to speak and who was not. They decided which fears were acceptable and which were forbidden. Some fears were permitted because they reinforced caution. Others were banned because they undermined confidence. This was the birth of emotional censorship. Long before laws, long before morals, humans learned to regulate expression. The fear that could not be framed usefully was silenced. The individual who spoke too much fear was labeled weak, unstable, or dangerous, not because fear was false, but because it was contagious, and contagious fear threatened the group more than the original danger. Language turned fear into power. Whoever controlled the narrative controlled the emotional state of the group. This meant that fear could now be used intentionally, not just suppressed, but directed. A leader could amplify fear to enforce obedience, or suppress fear to maintain authority. Truth no longer mattered as much as emotional impact. If fear motivated action in the desired direction, it was allowed. If it caused hesitation, it was crushed. This is when humans learned a subtle but permanent lesson. It was not enough to feel fear. One had to feel it at the right time, in the right amount, and for the right reason. Any deviation was punished, not always with violence, but with exclusion, ridicule, or mistrust. And because survival depended on acceptance, most people learned to internalize this control. They learned not to name certain fears. They learned to hide uncertainty behind confidence. They learned that silence was safer than honesty. This reshaped consciousness itself. Fear was no longer just a response to reality. It became a social event. It existed in language, in tone, in pauses, in what was not said. And from that moment forward, human societies were never the same, because once fear could speak, it could also be manipulated. And once it could be manipulated, truth lost its priority. What mattered was not what was real, but what people were allowed to feel. The danger was no longer just outside the group. It was inside it, in words, in stories, in warnings, in doubts. And so fear, given a voice, became one of the most powerful forces in human history. Fear could not be eliminated, so it had to be transformed. When early humans realized that silencing fear completely was impossible, they searched for another solution. They did not try to destroy fear, they tried to tame it. And this is how myths were born. Myths were not created to deceive, they were created to stabilize. A raw truth creates panic, but a shaped story creates meaning. The same danger, once placed inside a narrative, becomes tolerable. A storm that arrives without reason terrifies. A storm explained as intention calms the mind, because intention is easier to accept than randomness. The human brain struggles with chaos, but submits easily to purpose. This is why myths replaced explanation with meaning. They did not ask what happened, they answered why it happened, and that answer was enough. Fear without explanation paralyzes. Fear with meaning becomes manageable. Myths took the uncontrollable forces of nature and gave them personality. Lightning was no longer random energy, it was anger. Cold was no longer indifferent, it was punishment. Death was no longer meaningless, it was transition. By turning fear into intention, myths made it negotiable. You cannot negotiate with chaos, but you can appease a god. You cannot reason with randomness, but you can obey a rule. This psychological shift was revolutionary. It allowed humans to feel fear without falling apart. The myth did not remove danger, it removed helplessness, and helplessness was the most destructive emotion of all. A predator could be fought or avoided, but a meaningless universe could not be endured. Myths gave fear a face and a boundary. They said this far and no further. They defined what was feared and when it was feared. They limited fear in time and space. This is why rituals emerged. Rituals were repeated actions designed to reassure the group that fear was under control. They did not change reality. They changed perception, and perception was what mattered. The ritual said, "We have done what is required." The myth said, "The danger has been acknowledged." Together they created psychological safety. Not actual safety, but functional safety, and functional safety was enough for survival. Myths also solved another problem. They centralized fear. Before myths, fear was personal. After myths, fear was shared and synchronized. Everyone feared the same things in the same way. This reduced unpredictable reactions. A group that fears differently is unstable. A group that fears together is controllable. Myths aligned emotional responses. They told people when to fear and when not to fear. They prevented constant vigilance. Constant vigilance exhausts the mind, and an exhausted mind makes fatal mistakes. By outsourcing fear to stories, humans conserved mental energy. They no longer had to analyze every sound or shadow. The myth already explained what mattered. This reduced cognitive overload, and reduced overload increased survival. This is why myths spread so quickly and lasted so long. They were efficient. They required no proof. They demanded no debate. They simply worked. Myths also protected authority. Once fear was explained by a narrative, it no longer pointed upward. It did not question leadership. It did not blame decisions. It blamed forces beyond human control. This redirected anxiety away from the group and toward the unseen. The leader was no longer responsible for disaster. The myth was, this preserved hierarchy, and preserved hierarchy preserved order. Myths also punished curiosity. Questioning the myth meant reopening fear. Uncertainty returned. Chaos returned. So questioning became dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it destabilized the emotional structure that kept the group together. This is how myths became sacred. Not because they were true, but because they were necessary. They were treated as untouchable, because touching them risked unleashing unmanaged fear, and unmanaged fear had already proven itself deadly. Over time, humans stopped remembering why myths were created. They forgot that myths were tools. They began treating them as reality itself. The story replaced the event. The explanation replaced observation, and fear became fully mediated through belief. This was the moment when truth lost its immediacy. Reality was no longer experienced directly. It was interpreted first, and interpretation always came from the myth. The myth told people what they were allowed to feel. This made fear predictable. Predictable fear is less disruptive than unpredictable fear. This is why myths survived even when evidence contradicted them. They were not competing with facts. They were competing with panic, and panic always lost. That is why myths can survive reality, but reality cannot survive fear. Myths are fear made safe. Fear given boundaries, fear given purpose, fear given language. And once fear was safely contained inside myth, humans could move forward. They could build, they could plan, they could cooperate, because the terror of the unknown had been transformed into a story they could live with. Not a true story, a useful one. Once myths stabilized fear, another mechanism quietly emerged. Taboos were not created to explain reality. They were created to protect structure. If myths told people what to believe, taboos told them what not to say. This distinction was crucial, because some truths were not frightening because they were unknown. They were frightening because they were too clear. To speak them was to expose fragility. To name them was to risk collapse. So early human groups learned that silence could be more powerful than stories. There were things everyone sensed but no one articulated. The weakness of leaders, the randomness of death, the possibility that rituals might fail, the idea that protection was never guaranteed. These truths did not need investigation. They were visible, but visibility did not make them acceptable. Taboos were formed around precisely these realities, not because they were false, but because they were corrosive. They eroded confidence. They undermined cohesion. They reopened fear that myths had worked so hard to contain. The taboo did not say this is untrue. It said this must not be spoken, and this prohibition was enforced socially rather than logically. No arguments were offered, no explanations given. The rule was simple: do not go there, do not name this, do not ask. Taboos transformed truth into danger, not by denying it, but by criminalizing attention. The act of speaking became the threat. The individual who violated a taboo was not accused of being wrong. They were accused of being harmful. This shifted the moral frame. Silence became virtue. Speech became risk. The group learned that some knowledge carried a social cost too high to pay, and because survival depended on belonging, most people complied. They learned to feel truths privately and erase them publicly. They learned to recognize the boundary between thought and speech. This boundary was not intellectual, it was existential. Crossing it meant isolation. Isolation meant death. Taboos also simplified reality. By removing certain questions from circulation, they reduced cognitive strain. The group no longer had to confront uncomfortable uncertainties. The unspoken was treated as resolved by default, not because it was resolved, but because it was forbidden. This created an illusion of stability, an illusion strong enough to organize behavior. Taboos also reinforced hierarchy. When certain truths about power were unspeakable, authority became unquestionable. Leaders were protected not by evidence, but by silence. The absence of critique created the appearance of certainty, and certainty maintained obedience. This is why taboos were guarded so fiercely. Violating them did not just threaten belief, it threatened order. The group reacted swiftly, not always with violence, but with shame, ridicule, withdrawal. These punishments were effective because they attacked the deepest human fear: to be alone, to be excluded, to be seen as dangerous. Taboos turned social belonging into a conditional reward. Speak correctly and you are safe. Speak wrongly and you are exposed. This conditioned behavior across generations. Children learned taboos before they learned reasons. They absorbed them emotionally. They felt discomfort before they understood why. And emotional learning is durable. It does not require justification. It only requires repetition. Over time, taboos became invisible. They were no longer experienced as rules. They felt like reality itself. People did not think, "I am not allowed to say this." They thought, "This thought does not exist." This was the most effective form of control, because what cannot be thought cannot be challenged. And so truth was not only silenced, it was erased from the collective mind. Taboos did not eliminate fear, they redirected it. The fear was no longer of predators or storms. It was of words, of questions, of thoughts. This internalized fear was more manageable. It kept people aligned. It kept them predictable. It kept them quiet. This is why taboos survived technological progress. They survived environmental change. They survived migration and conflict because they addressed a permanent vulnerability, the fragility of human cohesion. Truth that threatens cohesion must be buried, not debated, not disproven, buried. And burial does not require force. It requires agreement, and agreement was always easier than confrontation. In this way, taboos became the negative space of culture. The shape of what was missing defined what was allowed. They drew invisible lines around consciousness itself. And once those lines were accepted, most people never noticed them again. They simply lived inside them. And this is how some of the most obvious truths in human history remained unspoken for thousands of years. Not because they were hidden, but because everyone knew they were too dangerous to say. Human survival was never an individual achievement. It was a collective condition. From the earliest moments of human existence, the group was not optional. It was life itself. To be accepted meant protection. To be rejected meant exposure, and exposure meant death. This reality shaped the human mind more deeply than any idea or belief. The fear of exclusion became stronger than the fear of predators or hunger, because predators could sometimes be escaped. Exile could not. Group psychology formed around this central truth, that belonging was survival. Every behavior, every expression, every belief was measured against one question: does this keep me inside the group or push me out of it? Once this calculation became internalized, humans no longer needed constant enforcement. They regulated themselves. The group did not have to silence the individual. The individuals silenced themselves. This self-censorship was more efficient than any external punishment because it was constant and invisible. Surveillance was no longer needed. The fear of being seen as different did the work automatically. When someone violated an unspoken rule, the reaction was immediate but often quiet. The group withdrew, eyes turned away, conversations stopped, attention disappeared. This was not random, it was a signal. You are no longer safe. This psychological pressure was devastating. Being ignored by the group triggered panic because the mind interpreted it as the first step toward death. This is why exile was the ultimate punishment. Not execution, not torture, but removal. To be cast out meant losing access to food, protection, knowledge, and companionship. It meant facing reality alone, and the human brain is not designed to survive alone. This is why conformity felt like morality. People did not follow rules because they were convinced. They followed them because they were terrified of the alternative. The group became the judge of reality. What the group accepted was real. What it rejected became invisible. Truth itself was filtered through social approval. A fact that endangered belonging was discarded regardless of its accuracy. This created a powerful feedback loop. The more the group agreed on something, the safer it felt. The safer it felt, the more real it became. Eventually, belief replaced observation. If everyone acted as if something was true, it became functionally true. This is how collective illusions formed, not through deception, but through alignment. The individual learned that disagreement was not a difference of opinion. It was a risk calculation, and the risk was too high to justify honesty. This is why early humans developed an acute sensitivity to social cues. They learned to read faces, tone, posture, silence. They learned when to speak and when to remain quiet. They learned how to adapt their beliefs publicly, even if privately they doubted. This duality became normal. Private doubt, public compliance. This psychological split allowed survival at the cost of authenticity. Those who failed to manage this split paid the price. They were labeled unstable, disloyal, dangerous. They were pushed to the margins, not necessarily expelled immediately, but marked, and being marked was enough. Others kept their distance. Resources were shared less. Information flowed around them. They became invisible before they were gone. This slow exile was more effective than sudden removal. It taught a lesson to everyone watching. This is what happens when you step outside. The group did not need to explain itself. The punishment spoke for itself. Over generations, this dynamic hardened into instinct. Children learned it without instruction. They sensed when to agree. They felt discomfort when questioning. They associated belonging with safety and difference with threat. This association became emotional, not logical. Even when circumstances changed, even when food became abundant and predators rare, the fear remained. The mind does not easily forget the conditions under which it evolved. Group psychology outlived its original environment, but its mechanisms remained intact. This is why humans still experience anxiety when disagreeing with a majority. This is why social rejection hurts more than physical pain, because for most of human history, rejection was fatal, and so exile became the silent weapon of civilization. Not dramatic, not visible, but absolute. It ensured obedience without chains. It preserved order without explanation, and it taught humanity a lesson that still defines behavior today. It is better to be wrong together than right alone, because alone is where survival ends. At a certain point in early human societies, truth was no longer treated merely as dangerous. It became something worse. It became immoral. This shift did not happen because truth suddenly changed. It happened because its effects became too disruptive. When truth threatened cohesion repeatedly, society stopped framing it as a risk and started framing it as wrong. This was a crucial psychological transformation, because once truth was labeled immoral, it no longer needed to be debated. It could be condemned. The question stopped being, is this accurate, and became, is this acceptable? Morality replaced reality as the measure of legitimacy. Truth that caused fear, doubt, or instability was not seen as honest, but as harmful, and harm was equated with evil. This allowed societies to protect themselves emotionally. By declaring certain truths immoral, they removed the burden of confronting them. The individual who spoke these truths was no longer just inconvenient. They were unethical. They were accused of lacking compassion, of spreading negativity, of weakening the group. This moral framing was powerful because it turned survival mechanisms into virtue. Silence was no longer fear-based behavior, it became goodness. Conformity was no longer submission, it became responsibility. To challenge a comforting belief was framed as cruelty. To disturb collective peace was framed as selfishness. This inversion reshaped conscience. People no longer asked whether something was true. They asked whether it was kind, whether it was appropriate, whether it was good for morale. And because humans crave moral approval, even more than factual certainty, this standard spread quickly. Once morality entered the equation, truth lost its protection. Evidence could be ignored if it violated ethical norms. The truth-teller could be dismissed not by disproving their claims, but by attacking their character. This allowed societies to preserve emotional stability while maintaining a sense of righteousness. They were not suppressing truth, they were defending goodness. This belief made suppression painless. The moralization of truth also protected myths and taboos. It wrapped them in ethical necessity. Questioning them was no longer curiosity, it was immorality. Doubt became sin, not because it was incorrect, but because it destabilized the moral order. This created a closed system. Beliefs were no longer supported by reality, but by virtue. To accept them was to be good. To reject them was to be dangerous. This system rewarded emotional alignment over intellectual honesty. It punished accuracy when accuracy caused discomfort, and because humans are social creatures, moral condemnation was more effective than force. No one wants to be seen as heartless or destructive. So many learned to suppress truths, even from themselves. They internalized the moral rules. They felt guilt not for lying, but for doubting. This was the deepest level of control. When truth felt wrong, even before it was spoken, the mind censored itself automatically. This is why societies could maintain falsehoods for generations without coercion. People genuinely believed that not knowing was better, not because ignorance was pleasant, but because it was virtuous. This moral structure also reframed suffering. If truth revealed pain, injustice, or vulnerability, it was labeled pessimistic. If it challenged hope, it was labeled corrosive. If it exposed uncertainty, it was labeled irresponsible. Optimism became moral, denial became kindness, and realism became cruelty. This moral hierarchy ensured that truth would always be on the defensive. It had to justify itself ethically before it could even be considered factually. And most truths failed this test, because reality is rarely comforting. By redefining truth as a moral issue, societies freed themselves from reality. They could choose beliefs based on emotional benefit rather than accuracy. This did not eliminate suffering, but it preserved meaning, and meaning mattered more than correctness. This is why truth has so often been punished, not as error but as immorality. The truth-teller was not accused of being wrong. They were accused of being dangerous, cold, divisive. This moral accusation justified exclusion without violence. It allowed societies to silence without guilt, and it taught individuals a final lesson. Survival requires belonging. Belonging requires moral conformity, and moral conformity often requires silence. This lesson did not fade with time. It adapted. It moved into new languages, new institutions, new values, but the core remained. When truth threatens the emotional structure of a group, it will be judged not by what it reveals, but by what it disrupts. And disruption framed as immorality is the most effective way to ensure that truth remains unsaid. The first lies were not created out of malice. They were born out of necessity. When early humans realized that truth could fracture the group and morality could silence it, something else quietly emerged. Lies that worked. These lies were not random fabrications. They were carefully shaped responses to fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability. They did not deny reality completely. They adjusted it just enough to make it livable. The first successful lie did not say, "Danger does not exist." It said, "Danger is under control." This single shift was transformative because it allowed humans to move forward without freezing in fear. A lie that reduced anxiety was immediately rewarded. It calmed the group, it restored coordination, it preserved leadership, and preservation meant survival. These early lies spread not because they were enforced, but because they were effective. They solved practical problems. They reduced panic. They simplified decisions. They provided clarity where reality offered none. In a chaotic environment, clarity was more valuable than accuracy. A simple falsehood that unified action was superior to a complex truth that caused hesitation. This is why lies began to outperform truths in social environments. They were easier to remember, easier to repeat, and easier to enforce. Truth required nuance. Lies required agreement, and agreement created power. Once a lie was shared by the group, it became self-reinforcing. The more people believed it, the safer it felt. The safer it felt, the more real it became. Eventually, the lie no longer needed defense. It became common sense. This is how belief systems solidified. They were not tested against reality. They were tested against stability. If a lie kept the group alive, it was validated by survival itself. This created a dangerous but efficient feedback loop. Success justified belief. Belief reinforced success. And truth became irrelevant in the process. The first lies also offered something truth never could: certainty. They answered questions without ambiguity. They closed discussions. They removed doubt. And in a world where doubt could be fatal, closure was priceless. Lies provided emotional shelter. They allowed humans to feel protected even when they were not. This feeling was enough to motivate action, and action was what mattered. Survival is not achieved by knowing everything. It is achieved by moving decisively, and decisive movement requires confidence, not accuracy. This is why lies were often rewarded socially. The individuals who reinforced comforting narratives were seen as stabilizers. They were trusted. They were followed. In contrast, those who questioned the lie threatened its function. They were seen as disruptive even if they were correct. The group did not need correct people. It needed reliable ones. This preference shaped social hierarchies. Leaders were not chosen for truthfulness. They were chosen for their ability to maintain belief. Once lies proved their utility, they became institutionalized. They were embedded in rituals, stories, and norms. They stopped being perceived as lies. They became tradition, and tradition carries authority beyond logic. To challenge tradition was not to correct an error. It was to threaten identity. This made lies resilient. They could survive contradiction because they were no longer factual claims. They were social contracts. Breaking them meant breaking trust. This is why early lies were protected so fiercely. They were the glue holding fragile groups together. Their success lay not in deception, but in cohesion. They synchronized behavior. They aligned emotion. They minimized conflict. And conflict was deadly. The lie became a tool of coordination. As long as it functioned, it was preserved. Even when circumstances changed, even when evidence accumulated, even when reality contradicted it, the lie endured, because its value was not in its truth, but in its effect. This is the origin of a pattern that still defines human societies. Lies that comfort survive. Lies that unify dominate. Lies that simplify outcompete complex truths. The first lies taught humanity a profound lesson. Perception matters more than reality. Belief shapes behavior, and behavior determines survival. Once this lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned. It was passed down, embedded into culture, language, and instinct. This is why lies often feel natural and truth feels abrasive. The human mind was trained to prefer what works over what is accurate, and what works is not always true, but it is effective, and effectiveness has always been rewarded. This is why the first lies did not disappear. They evolved, they adapted. They learned to wear the mask of morality, tradition, and identity. They became invisible. And when lies become invisible, they no longer need protection. They defend themselves. Because anyone who threatens them threatens the system built on them, and systems do not surrender easily. Not because they are evil, but because they are afraid. Afraid of what happens when the comforting lie collapses and the raw truth returns. Unguided, unfiltered. Lies survive longer than truth because they adapt to human weakness, while truth exposes it. Truth demands adjustment. Lies demand comfort. From the beginning of human history, survival favored what reduced friction, not what increased understanding. Lie does not ask the mind to change. It asks the mind to rest. Truth, on the other hand, forces re-evaluation. It threatens habits, beliefs, identities, and social bonds. This makes truth expensive while lies are cheap. They require less energy, less courage, and less sacrifice. The human brain is not designed to seek discomfort. It is designed to minimize pain and maximize predictability, and lies excel at providing predictability. They offer clear narratives with defined roles. They simplify chaos into order. They remove ambiguity, which the mind finds exhausting. A lie answers questions quickly. Truth often multiplies them. This alone gives lies a massive advantage. But there is more. Lies do not merely comfort individuals. They synchronize groups. A shared lie creates unity. A shared truth can create division, because people interpret truth differently, but lies are designed to be consumed uniformly. This makes lies socially efficient. They spread faster because they are easier to understand, easier to repeat, and easier to defend. Truth requires context, nuance, and patience. Lies require agreement, and agreement feels like safety. The longer a lie circulates, the more embedded it becomes. It begins to shape memory. Language adapts to it. Stories form around it. Children inherit it before they inherit doubt. At that point, the lie no longer competes with truth. It competes with identity, and identity always wins. Truth can be ignored, but identity cannot be abandoned without pain. This is why lies gain moral protection. They are no longer just beliefs. They become values. To question them is framed as betrayal, not correction. This framing ensures longevity. A lie protected by morality survives evidence because evidence cannot defeat loyalty. Once a lie becomes part of how people see themselves, abandoning it feels like self-destruction. The human mind avoids this at all costs. It will reject reality before rejecting itself. This is why lies grow stronger over time. They benefit from repetition. The more a lie is repeated, the more familiar it feels. And familiarity is often mistaken for truth. The brain equates repetition with reliability. This cognitive shortcut evolved to save time and energy, but it also makes humans vulnerable to persistent falsehoods. Truth does not benefit from repetition in the same way. It can be repeated endlessly and still feel uncomfortable because it demands change. Lies ask for nothing. Truth asks for action. This difference is decisive. Lies also survive because they provide emotional rewards. They offer hope even when unwarranted. They promise control even when none exists. They reduce anxiety by offering explanations that feel complete. Truth often does the opposite. It reveals uncertainty. It exposes vulnerability. It admits limits, and humans do not like limits. They prefer illusions of control to honest helplessness. This preference is ancient. It kept early humans moving when paralysis would have killed them. But in modern societies, it keeps lies alive long after their usefulness has expired. Another reason lies endure is that they are flexible. Truth is rigid. It does not negotiate. Lies can be adjusted without collapsing. They can absorb contradictions, reinterpret failures, and shift blame. This adaptability makes them resilient. When reality challenges a lie, the lie evolves. When reality challenges truth, truth remains unchanged and therefore vulnerable. Lies also benefit from power structures. They serve those in control by maintaining order and reducing dissent. Truth disrupts power by introducing uncertainty and questioning authority. This makes truth inconvenient and lies useful, and usefulness ensures protection. Lies are promoted, reinforced, and rewarded. Truth is tolerated only when it aligns with existing structures. When it does not, it is marginalized, ignored, or attacked. This imbalance ensures that lies have institutional support, while truth relies on individual courage, and courage is rare because it is costly. Lies require no bravery. Truth requires sacrifice. This asymmetry shapes outcomes over time. Most people do not actively choose lies. They drift into them because they are easier to live with. They allow normalcy to continue. They preserve routines. They prevent conflict. This passive preference accumulates until lies dominate cultural memory. Truth may surface occasionally, but it does not stay long. It disrupts too much. It demands too much. And societies built on stability resist disruption by default. This is why lies are not defeated by facts. Facts alone do not address emotional investment. The longer a lie lives, the more emotional weight it carries. It becomes tied to belonging, pride, and shared history. Untangling truth from that web feels like loss, and humans avoid loss more than they seek accuracy. Modern humans like to believe they are different. They believe technology made them smarter. They believe access to information made them freer. They believe they escaped the ancient traps of myth, fear, and illusion. But the truth is simpler and far less comforting. Modern humans did not abandon comfortable lies. They perfected them. In the past, lies were necessary to survive physically. Today, lies are necessary to survive psychologically. The threats have changed. Predators are rare. Famine is distant, but anxiety is constant. Uncertainty is everywhere, and the human mind still reacts the same way. It seeks relief, not accuracy. Modern life overwhelms the senses. There is too much information, too many voices, too many possibilities. Truth no longer arrives slowly. It arrives all at once, and the brain cannot process it. So it filters, and what it filters for is not truth, but comfort. Rahat yalanlar are not always explicit falsehoods. They are narratives that reduce complexity. They explain the world without demanding effort. They offer identity without responsibility. They tell people who they are, who to blame, and what to believe, without forcing self-examination. These lies feel harmless because they are soothing. They do not shock. They do not threaten. They fit neatly into daily routines. Algorithms understand this. They amplify what feels good, not what is accurate. They reward content that confirms beliefs, not content that challenges them. This creates an environment where comfortable lies are constantly reinforced, while uncomfortable truths are quietly buried, not censored violently but drowned out. The modern individual rarely feels lied to. They feel reassured, they feel understood, they feel aligned. This emotional satisfaction replaces verification. The question is no longer, is this true? It is, does this feel right? If it feels right, it is accepted. If it feels disturbing, it is rejected. This emotional filter is faster than reason and far more persuasive. Modern lies are also personalized. They adapt to the individual. They speak in familiar language. They mirror values. They flatter identity. This makes them harder to detect because they do not feel imposed. They feel chosen. Truth, on the other hand, feels intrusive. It interrupts comfort. It introduces doubt. It asks for change. And change is exhausting in a world already overloaded. This is why modern humans defend comfortable lies passionately, not because they are ignorant, but because they are tired. They want stability in a chaotic environment. They want certainty in a world that constantly shifts. Comfortable lies offer that. They provide simple explanations for complex problems. They reduce moral burden. They allow people to feel good without acting. This is especially powerful in moral contexts. Truth often demands responsibility. It reveals complicity. It exposes systems that benefit some at the expense of others. Comfortable lies avoid this. They redirect blame. They minimize agency. They reassure people that nothing significant needs to change. This is why modern lies often present themselves as optimism, hope without effort, positivity without accountability. They shame realism by calling it negativity. They frame critical thinking as cynicism. This moral inversion protects the lie by associating truth with discomfort and discomfort with harm. Modern societies ensure that lies feel virtuous. Modern humans also mistake consensus for truth. When many people repeat the same idea, it feels validated. This social proof replaces evidence, and because digital environments exaggerate visibility, consensus can be manufactured quickly. Once a lie appears widely accepted, it becomes risky to challenge it. Challenging it threatens social belonging, and the ancient fear of exclusion still operates beneath the surface. The fear of being isolated, mocked, or ignored online triggers the same psychological alarms as physical exile did in the past. So people self-censor. They share what aligns. They stay silent about what disrupts. This maintains the dominance of comfortable lies. Modern education does not fully counter this because information alone does not change emotional preference. People can know facts and still choose narratives that feel safer. The mind prioritizes emotional equilibrium over factual accuracy. This is not stupidity, it is adaptation. In an environment of constant stimulation, the mind seeks refuge, and lies provide refuge. They simplify, they stabilize, they promise meaning without struggle. This is why modern humans often say they want the truth but react defensively when confronted with it. They want truth that confirms, not truth that confronts. They want enlightenment without disorientation. They want clarity without cost. But truth has always had a cost, and comfortable lies exist to avoid paying it. This is why they thrive today more than ever. They are integrated into media, politics, culture, and personal identity. They do not announce themselves as lies. They present as common sense, as balance, as moderation. This makes them resilient. They are rare. Doubt was once rare because information was rare. When knowledge arrived slowly, each new fact carried weight. People questioned because they had time to question. They examined because there was space to examine. But in the age of information, abundance, doubt did not grow stronger. It grew weaker. Not because people know more, but because they are surrounded by too much. The modern human does not face a lack of answers. They face an overflow of them. Every question generates thousands of responses. Every response contradicts another, and the mind cannot hold all of them at once. This overload does not produce curiosity, it produces fatigue, and fatigue is the enemy of doubt. True doubt requires energy. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to stay uncomfortable without resolution. But the modern environment does not reward this. It punishes it. Speed is valued more than depth, confidence more than hesitation, immediacy more than reflection. In such conditions, doubt feels inefficient. It slows consumption. It disrupts flow. So the mind adapts by shutting it down. Instead of asking which of these is true, the modern human asks which of these is easier to accept. This is not a conscious choice. It is a survival mechanism for the psyche. Information abundance creates a false sense of mastery. People feel informed because they are exposed. They mistake familiarity for understanding. They see headlines, summaries, fragments, and believe they know enough. This illusion reduces the impulse to question. Why doubt what feels already known? Shallow knowledge creates deep confidence, and deep confidence kills doubt. The algorithms that structure information flow intensify this effect. They do not present reality, they present preference. They learn what calms, what excites, what reassures, and they feed it back endlessly. This creates informational echo chambers where doubt feels unnecessary because contradiction is rare. When opposing views do appear, they feel intrusive, aggressive, hostile. This emotional framing discourages engagement. The mind rejects them, not on logical grounds, but on emotional ones. This further weakens doubt because doubt requires exposure to uncertainty. Information abundance also blurs the line between fact, opinion, and interpretation. In a constant stream, everything looks equally valid or equally suspect. This creates epistemic paralysis. When everything might be false, nothing feels worth questioning deeply. The mind chooses shortcuts. It relies on trust cues, identity signals, and emotional resonance rather than verification. This is why doubt in the modern age often turns into cynicism instead of inquiry. People stop asking what is true and start assuming nothing is. This is not skepticism, it is resignation, and resignation is comfortable. It removes responsibility to think further. True doubt is demanding. It forces the individual to remain open, vulnerable, and unsure. But modern culture rewards certainty. Social platforms amplify confident statements, not tentative ones. Messages framed with absolute conviction spread faster than nuanced reflections. This teaches people subconsciously that doubt is weakness. Uncertainty becomes a liability. Hesitation becomes invisibility. So people learn to present conclusions, not questions. They learn to perform certainty even when they feel unsure. This performance erodes genuine doubt over time. The more certainty is rehearsed, the less doubt is felt. Information abundance also accelerates forgetting. Truths are quickly replaced by newer truths before they can be integrated. This constant turnover prevents deep understanding. Doubt requires memory. It requires holding conflicting ideas over time. But when attention shifts every second, there is no continuity, no space for sustained questioning. The mind skims rather than dwells, and without dwelling, doubt cannot mature. Instead of deep inquiry, people engage in rapid validation. They check reactions, likes, shares, agreement. This social feedback replaces epistemic validation. The question becomes not is this true, but is this accepted? If it is accepted, doubt feels unnecessary. If it is rejected, doubt feels dangerous. This ties doubt directly to social risk, and humans avoid social risk instinctively. Information abundance also democratizes voice but not wisdom. Everyone can speak, but few listen deeply. This creates noise, not dialogue, and in noise, doubt dissolves. It cannot compete with volume. The loudest narratives dominate regardless of accuracy. This teaches people that truth is not discovered through questioning but through repetition. Doubt feels futile in such an environment. Why question when answers are already everywhere? This abundance paradoxically recreates the conditions of ancient myths, not through scarcity but through saturation. People outsource understanding to systems feeds, influencers, authorities. This reduces cognitive burden but also eliminates doubt. The modern human does not lack information. They lack silence. Silence is where doubt lives. Without silence, the mind cannot hear its own. Comfort is not permanent. It only exists as long as the illusions supporting it remain intact. When those illusions collapse, the human mind does not respond calmly. It does not slowly adjust. It panics, because comfort was never just a feeling. It was a structure. It organized beliefs, routines, expectations, and identity. When comfort collapses, all of these collapse with it. The first reaction is denial. The mind refuses to accept the disruption. It searches desperately for explanations that preserve the old narrative. Any explanation is preferred over uncertainty. This is why, when comfortable lies break, people cling to new lies immediately. They do not seek truth, they seek replacement. Comfort must be restored as quickly as possible. If denial fails, anger follows. The individual looks for something to blame, something external, something tangible, because accepting internal error is too painful. Anger creates the illusion of control. It gives direction to fear. It feels active rather than helpless. This is why periods of collapsing comfort often coincide with social hostility, polarization, and scapegoating. People are not reacting to facts. They are reacting to the loss of psychological safety. Once anger exhausts itself, fear surfaces raw and unfiltered. This is the fear that myths and lies were designed to suppress. The fear of not knowing, the fear of instability, the fear of meaninglessness. At this stage, people experience anxiety, confusion, and existential distress. They question not just beliefs, but their place in the world. This is the most dangerous moment because it is unstable. Some individuals retreat inward. They disengage. They shut down emotionally. This numbness is a defense mechanism. It protects the mind from overload, but it also reduces agency. Other individuals move in the opposite direction. They radicalize. They seek absolute answers. They become receptive to extreme narratives because extremity promises certainty. Extreme beliefs are attractive during collapse because they replace ambiguity with clarity. They offer simple explanations for complex breakdowns. This is why moments of comfort collapse are fertile ground for authoritarianism, fanaticism, and mass movements. People are not choosing oppression. They are choosing relief. Relief from uncertainty is more appealing than freedom without direction. Comfort collapse also exposes suppressed truths. Realities that were previously ignored resurface. Old grievances reappear. Hidden inequalities become visible. Unspoken fears gain voice. This sudden exposure overwhelms the collective psyche because these truths arrive without preparation. They are not integrated gradually. They erupt. This eruption feels like chaos, even if it is reality asserting itself. The human response to chaos is not curiosity, it is control. People demand order, they demand rules, they demand certainty. This often leads societies to recreate the same structures that collapsed, but in harsher forms. New myths are born quickly. They are louder, simpler, and more rigid than the old ones, because they must compete with fear already unleashed. The cycle repeats, but with less subtlety. Comfort collapse also fractures trust. People no longer trust institutions, narratives, or each other. This erosion of trust isolates individuals socially, even when they are physically surrounded. This isolation intensifies fear because the group no longer feels protective. When trust collapses, belonging collapses, and when belonging collapses, survival instincts activate. This returns humanity to its oldest psychological state. Everyone for themselves. This state is unsustainable, so people rush to rebuild collective identity. But the rebuilt identity is often exclusionary. It defines itself by who does not belong, because exclusion feels like control, and control feels like safety. At the individual level, comfort collapse can trigger awakening, but this path is rare and painful. It requires tolerating uncertainty without immediate resolution. It requires sitting with discomfort without replacing it with illusion. This path demands psychological strength, emotional resilience, and patience. Most people are not supported to develop these traits, so they choose faster routes. They choose belief, certainty, and alignment, even if false. This is why comfort collapse does not automatically lead to truth. It often leads to stronger lies. The lies must now carry more weight. They must compensate for deeper fear. This makes them more aggressive, less tolerant of doubt, and more hostile to questioning. Truth becomes even more dangerous in these moments because it prolongs discomfort, and discomfort is seen as the enemy. This is why truth-tellers are most persecuted during periods of collapse, not during stability, during crisis. When comfort is gone, society cannot afford additional uncertainty, so it attacks those who represent it. But comfort collapse also leaves traces. It plants seeds of doubt in some minds. It reveals the fragility of systems once thought permanent. These seeds may not grow immediately. In the ancient world, truth did not disappear. It became visible, and visibility made it punishable. For the first time in human history, truth stepped out of myth and into speech, into argument, into public space. Philosophy was born not as a celebration of truth, but as a risk. The ancient world did not fear ignorance. It feared destabilization, and truth was destabilizing because it questioned foundations once protected by silence and myth. In early civilizations, truth was no longer only a psychological threat. It became a political one when individuals began to ask not just why storms happen, but why laws exist and why rulers rule. Truth entered territory guarded by power. This changed everything, because power can tolerate mystery, but it cannot tolerate scrutiny. Myths protected authority by placing explanation beyond human reach. Truth pulled explanation back into the human realm. It suggested that systems were made, not ordained, and what is made can be unmade. This implication was dangerous. In ancient cities, truth was allowed only within carefully drawn boundaries. It could examine nature, mathematics, and abstraction, but not authority, morality, or collective belief. The moment truth crossed into these domains, it triggered punishment, not debate. The punishment was rarely framed as silencing truth. It was framed as protecting order, harmony, stability. The ancient world valued balance above accuracy. Truth that disturbed balance was considered violent, even if it was spoken calmly. This is why truth-tellers were not accused of lying. They were accused of corrupting minds, weakening youth, insulting gods, or threatening unity. These charges were moral and civic, not factual. They reframed truth as crime. Once truth became crime, punishment followed naturally. Not because truth was false, but because it was disruptive. The ancient world understood something modern societies often forget. Order is fragile, and truth has weight. When introduced too suddenly, it can fracture social cohesion. Ancient punishment was therefore preventative. It sought to deter questioning before it spread. The goal was not to refute ideas, but to stop contagion. The truth-teller became a symbol of instability. To punish them was to reassure the many. This public aspect of punishment was essential. Exile, trials, humiliation, and execution were not just penalties, they were messages. They said, "This is the cost of asking too much." The ancient crowd learned from spectacle. They absorbed the lesson emotionally rather than intellectually, and emotional learning lasts longer. In this way, truth became associated with danger in collective memory. The mind learned that insight carries risk. This association discouraged curiosity outside safe domains. Philosophy itself was shaped by this pressure. Thinkers learned to speak indirectly, to use allegory, irony, and abstraction. They hid truth inside language to avoid punishment. This did not make truth safer, it made it slower and less accessible, but it allowed it to survive. Ancient truth learned to wear masks. It learned to disguise itself as myth poetry or paradox. This was not cowardice, it was adaptation. The environment demanded it. The ancient world also revealed a crucial paradox. The more advanced a society became, the more it punished destabilizing truth. Complex systems require stronger cohesion. The cost of disruption increases with scale. This meant that truth became more dangerous as civilizations grew larger. More people depended on shared belief. More institutions rested on unexamined assumptions. Truth threatened all of them simultaneously. This is why ancient empires tolerated many gods, but not many truths. Diversity of ritual was manageable. Diversity of foundational belief was not. Truth that questioned the legitimacy of power threatened the entire structure, and structures respond with force. The ancient world normalized this response over time. Punishment became tradition. It was no longer questioned. It was expected. The truth teller was no longer tragic. They were irresponsible. They should have known better. This normalization created a powerful deterrent. Most people learned to self-limit. They sensed where questions ended. They internalized boundaries. The punishment no longer needed to be applied often. The threat was enough. This internalization is the true legacy of ancient punishment. Not the death of thinkers, but the shaping of minds. The ancient world taught humanity that truth is not free. It carries consequences, and those consequences are rarely paid by those in power. They are paid by those who speak without protection. This lesson did not end with antiquity. It became a template. It was inherited by later eras, adapted, refined, and institutionalized. But its core remained. When truth threatens the foundations of collective order, punishment follows, not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of preservation. The ancient world did not hate truth. It feared what would happen if everyone listened to it at once, and so it chose order over honesty, stability over accuracy. In the Middle Ages, truth did not merely become dangerous, it became sinful. This was not a small shift, it was a complete transformation of how reality itself was understood. Truth was no longer judged by its consequences or its accuracy, but by its alignment with divine authority. What contradicted doctrine was not debated, it was condemned. The question was no longer, is this true, but does this obey? The Middle Ages inherited the ancient fear of destabilization, but wrapped it in sacred certainty. If truth challenged power in antiquity, it challenged God in the medieval world. And challenging God was not intellectual rebellion, it was moral corruption. This framing was devastatingly effective, because fear of punishment was no longer limited to exile or death. It extended beyond life itself. Truth now threatened the soul, not just the body. The cost of speaking extended into eternity. This fundamentally changed human psychology. People did not merely silence themselves, they felt guilt for thinking. The mind became a dangerous place. The medieval world did not suppress truth accidentally, it did so systematically. Belief systems were centralized. Religious authority defined reality. Every explanation of the world had to fit within sacred interpretation. Nature, history, morality, and identity were all filtered through doctrine. Any alternative explanation was heresy. Heresy was not treated as error. It was treated as infection, an infection that could spread and damn others. This justified extreme measures, because the goal was no longer order alone, it was salvation. Silencing truth became an act of mercy. By this logic, burning a heretic was not cruelty, it was protection. Protection of the many from doubt, from confusion, from spiritual danger. This moral inversion allowed violence to feel righteous. The medieval world perfected the union of fear and virtue. Punishment was no longer just enforcement, it was purification. This made truth uniquely vulnerable, because truth by its nature questions, and questioning implied doubt, and doubt implied lack of faith, and lack of faith implied moral failure. The chain was complete. Truth became indistinguishable from sin. This environment reshaped knowledge itself. Observation was suspect unless confirmed by Scripture. Reason was tolerated only when it served belief. Philosophy was forced to kneel before theology. Thinkers learned to frame discoveries as confirmations of faith, not challenges to it. Language became cautious, layered, indirect. Many truths survived only as whispers, annotations, marginal notes. They hid in monasteries, manuscripts, metaphors, and even there they were fragile. Because discovery was not the danger, interpretation was. To see something was one thing. To explain it differently was another. The medieval mind learned to fear interpretation more than ignorance. It was safer not to know than to know incorrectly. This fear produced intellectual stagnation, not because humans lacked intelligence, but because intelligence without permission was lethal. Truth seekers were not seen as brave. They were seen as arrogant. To seek truth independently was pride, and pride was the original sin. This association cut deep. It taught generations that humility meant obedience, not curiosity, that wisdom meant submission, not understanding. This lesson embedded itself into conscience. People policed themselves. They rejected thoughts before they formed. They experienced anxiety at the edge of insight. This internal censorship was the greatest achievement of medieval control. No guards were needed when belief lived inside the mind. The medieval world also blurred the line between comfort and holiness. Comforting beliefs were framed as righteous. Uncomfortable truths were framed as temptation. Suffering was explained as divine will. Questioning it was rebellion. This removed the possibility of critique. If injustice was ordained, then resistance was immoral. Truth that exposed exploitation or error became blasphemy. This protected institutions while appearing sacred. The medieval order endured not because it was flawless, but because it was unquestionable. And unquestionability is stronger than force. This period demonstrated something essential. Absolutism does not fear lies. It fears competing truths. The medieval system tolerated countless superstitions, myths, and inconsistencies, but it could not tolerate doubt directed upward. Doubt threatened the source of authority itself. So truth was not simply punished, it was spiritually criminalized. The soul became the battlefield, and most people chose safety over clarity, eternal certainty over temporary understanding. This choice was rational within the framework imposed. The medieval world offered a clear bargain: obey and be saved, question and be lost. And so truth retreated once again, not destroyed, not disproven, but buried beneath layers of sacred meaning. It waited in silence, preserved by those careful enough to hide it. This is why when truth resurfaced later, it did so explosively. In the Renaissance, truth returned, but it did not return gently. It returned cautiously, uncertainly, and with fear still clinging to it like a shadow. The Middle Ages had not destroyed truth, but they had taught humanity what truth could cost. So when truth began to reappear, it did so quietly, disguised as curiosity, art, science, and rediscovery rather than rebellion. People did not announce that truth was back. They said the past was being remembered. They said ancient texts were being rediscovered. They said beauty, proportion, and reason were being admired. But beneath these harmless words, something far more dangerous was happening. The authority over truth was shifting. It was moving away from exclusive divine interpretation and back toward human observation. And this shift terrified everyone, including those who benefited from it. The Renaissance did not feel like liberation to those living inside it. It felt like instability. For centuries, certainty had come from above. Now certainty was being questioned from below. This created a psychological vacuum. People were no longer sure who had the right to explain reality. God, church tradition, and scripture had provided a single voice. Now multiple voices began to emerge. Artists, scientists, philosophers, and thinkers looked at the world directly and described what they saw. This directness was revolutionary, not because it was new, but because it had been forbidden. The act of observing nature without immediately translating it into doctrine was an act of quiet defiance. But defiance still carried danger, so Renaissance truth learned to negotiate. It did not openly reject faith, it coexisted with it. It framed discovery as admiration of divine creation rather than correction of divine narrative. This careful framing reveals the fear still present. Truth was allowed back into society only if it pretended to serve the old order rather than replace it. This tension defined the Renaissance. On the surface, it celebrated human potential, creativity, and reason. But beneath the celebration was anxiety. What if humans were wrong? What if observation contradicted belief? What if the world was not arranged according to sacred expectation? These questions were terrifying because they reopened the wound that medieval certainty had sealed. The Renaissance mind lived between two fears, the fear of ignorance and the fear of punishment. This created contradiction. People wanted to know, but they were afraid to know fully. They wanted truth, but not its consequences. So truth returned fragmented. In art, it appeared as realism, proportion, and perspective. In science, it appeared as measurement, experimentation, and classification. In philosophy, it appeared as humanism. But in all these forms, it avoided direct confrontation with ultimate authority. The Renaissance did not overthrow doctrine, it tested its edges. And even this testing provoked fear. Power structures reacted cautiously, not violently at first. They observed. They adapted. They tolerated limited inquiry because they believed they could control it. But inquiry does not remain limited for long. Once observation begins, it leads inevitably to comparison, and comparison leads to contradiction, and contradiction demands resolution. This is where new fears emerged. Not the old fear of heresy alone, but the fear of chaos. What if too many truths existed? What if reality had multiple interpretations? What if certainty itself was an illusion? The Renaissance exposed humanity to epistemic anxiety for the first time on a large scale. People realized that truth was not singular, easily defined, or universally agreed upon. This realization was destabilizing. It threatened not only religion but identity. If truth depends on observation and observation varies, then what anchors meaning? This question haunted the Renaissance. It was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. Art captured this tension. Bodies were idealized yet fragile. Beauty was celebrated yet impermanent. Science advanced yet uncertainty grew. The more humans understood the world, the less secure they felt about their place in it. This paradox defines the Renaissance. Truth returned, but it brought doubt with it, and doubt was frightening because it offered no final authority. The old system had answered every question, even if inaccurately. The new approach asked questions without guaranteeing answers. This demanded psychological resilience that few possessed. So society oscillated. Some embraced inquiry, some retreated into tradition. Most lived between these poles, selectively accepting truth when it felt empowering and rejecting it when it felt threatening. This selective acceptance created inconsistency. Truth was welcomed in art and technology, but resisted in cosmology, morality, and power. The Renaissance did not eliminate punishment. It relocated it. Truth-tellers were still at risk, but the lines were blurred. They were not always burned, but they were silenced, marginalized, or forced to recant. This ambiguity created uncertainty rather than safety. In the modern world, truth did not disappear and it did not become sacred. It became managed. Power no longer needed to silence truth openly because it learned something more effective. Controlling truth is safer than destroying it. Modern systems realize that people do not need truth to be removed. They need it to be shaped, filtered, delayed, and contextualized. When truth is overwhelming, it paralyzes. When it is selective, it directs. Modern power understands this deeply. It does not ask people to stop questioning. It encourages endless questioning without resolution. This creates the illusion of freedom while preventing clarity. Truth is no longer forbidden. It is diluted. The modern world produces more facts than any previous era, but fewer conclusions. Information is abundant, meaning is scarce. This imbalance benefits power because confused minds seek guidance, and guidance comes from those who control interpretation. In modern societies, authority does not say this is true. It says experts disagree, data is complex, context matters. This language does not lie. It postpones judgment, and postponed judgment prevents action. Truth becomes an ongoing discussion rather than a catalyst for change. This is a form of control more subtle than censorship. People feel informed while remaining passive. Modern power also fragments truth. It breaks it into pieces, statistics, headlines, sound bites, and reports. Each piece alone feels insufficient to provoke response. To understand the whole requires time, focus, and synthesis. And time, focus, and synthesis are luxuries few possess. This structural complexity protects systems from accountability. No single lie needs to be defended because no single truth is allowed to fully emerge. Modern surveillance plays a critical role here. Not just physical surveillance, but cognitive surveillance. Algorithms track attention, emotion, preference. They learn what people avoid, what they engage with, and what makes them uncomfortable. Then they optimize flow to minimize friction. Truth that causes discomfort is not banned. It is simply deprioritized. It sinks beneath layers of content designed to soothe, distract, and entertain. This makes control feel voluntary. People believe they choose what they see, not realizing how options are curated. This curation shapes worldview more effectively than force ever could. Modern power also exploits the language of freedom. Free speech becomes noise. Freedom of choice becomes overload. In this environment, truth competes for attention, not authority. And attention is governed by emotion, not accuracy. This favors narratives that provoke outrage, fear, or comfort, not reflection. Power does not need to convince everyone of one lie. It needs to prevent shared understanding. Multiple competing truths cancel each other out. This fragmentation ensures that collective action is rare even when problems are widely recognized. The modern individual feels constantly informed but rarely grounded. They sense that something is wrong but cannot articulate it clearly. This vague unease prevents focused resistance. It keeps dissatisfaction diffuse. Power thrives in diffusion. Another transformation is moralization. Truth is no longer debated solely on factual grounds. It is filtered through identity politics, ideology, and moral signaling. This shifts discussion from reality to allegiance. People defend positions not because they are true, but because they belong to them. To admit error feels like betrayal of self. This locks beliefs in place even when evidence accumulates. Modern control benefits from this rigidity. It turns truth into a battlefield of identities rather than a process of discovery. In such battles, power remains untouched while groups fight each other. Modern institutions also use transparency strategically. They release information selectively at moments that minimize impact. This creates the appearance of openness while maintaining control. The public sees documents, reports, and data and assumes accountability, but volume replaces clarity. The sheer amount of information overwhelms analysis. This is not secrecy, it is saturation, and saturation is more effective because it exhausts critical capacity. Truth fatigue sets in. People stop reacting not because they are satisfied, but because they are tired. This exhaustion creates apathy. Apathy is the most stable form of control because it feels natural. Modern power does not fear truth. It fears coordinated unders. When humans began to speak, truth became more dangerous than it had ever been before. Before language, fear was silent. It lived in muscles, breath, and reflex. It passed quickly. It rose and fell. Language changed this completely. The moment fear could be named, it could be remembered. The moment it could be remembered, it could be shared. And the moment it could be shared, it could spread beyond the original danger. Words allowed humans to carry fear across time and space. A threat no longer needed to be present to be real. It only needed to be described. This was revolutionary and catastrophic at the same time. Language transformed isolated perception into collective reality. One person's observation could now reshape the emotional state of the entire group. A single sentence could trigger panic even in safety. This gave truth a new kind of power, not physical but psychological. Truth spoken aloud could reorganize behavior, redirect movement, and alter trust. The group no longer reacted only to what they saw. They reacted to what they heard, and what they heard was filtered through imagination. Imagination magnified danger. A rustle in the bushes became a predator. A shadow became an enemy. Language filled gaps with images stronger than reality itself. This amplification made truth volatile. A statement like, "There is danger," did not remain neutral. It created anticipation, and anticipation altered decision-making. Groups slowed. They hesitated. They questioned direction. And hesitation was lethal. This is why spoken truth became more threatening than unseen danger. Before language, danger acted on the body. After language, danger acted on the mind. And the mind is contagious. Fear transmitted through words spread faster than fear transmitted through sight. Language also changed memory. Once a frightening truth was spoken, it could be repeated. Every repetition reinforced it. The group relived fear without new stimulus. This created sustained anxiety rather than momentary response. Sustained anxiety exhausted attention, drained coordination, and weakened cohesion. From the perspective of survival, this was unacceptable. So early human groups learned that not all truths could be spoken. Some truths were too powerful once verbalized. They destabilized even when accurate. This forced a new form of control, not of behavior, but of speech. The group began to regulate language itself. Who could speak, when they could speak, what could be said. This was the beginning of authority over narrative. Truth no longer belonged to observation. It belonged to permission. If someone spoke a truth that disrupted confidence, they were not challenged intellectually. They were silenced socially, because the danger was not the content. The danger was the effect. Language also allowed truth to challenge hierarchy. Before, speech leadership was demonstrated through action. After, speech leadership could be questioned verbally. This was a direct threat. A spoken doubt undermined authority more effectively than disobedience because it planted doubt in others. One person questioning could become many questioning. This collective uncertainty could dismantle leadership structures rapidly. So speech that questioned direction, decisions, or competence became dangerous regardless of accuracy. The group did not ask whether the speaker was right. They asked whether the speaker endangered unity. This is when truth became subordinate to stability. Language forced societies to choose between expression and cohesion always won. This choice shaped moral instincts. Speaking uncomfortable truth began to feel wrong, not because it was false, but because it felt harmful. This emotional association embedded itself deeply. Over time, people learned to anticipate the reaction before speaking. They felt fear before truth reached the tongue. This preemptive fear was internalized censorship. Language also enabled abstraction. Truth was no longer limited to immediate danger. It could describe future threats, hypothetical risks, unseen consequences. This expanded the scope of fear infinitely. The group could now fear what had not happened yet. This constant projection was unbearable, so abstraction had to be limited. Future-oriented truths were especially dangerous because they created anxiety without resolution. They demanded preparation for uncertain outcomes. The group could not live in perpetual anticipation, so these truths were suppressed, dismissed, or reframed. This is where reassurance narratives gained importance. They countered abstract fear with concrete certainty. Language thus split into two functions, one that revealed and one that calmed. The second was favored, the first was restricted. This imbalance defined communication norms. Language did not evolve to maximize truth, it evolved to regulate emotion. The most valued speakers were not the most accurate, but the most stabilizing. They knew how to phrase reality in ways that maintained confidence. These speakers became leaders, storytellers, priests, and later authorities. When language entered human life, it did not remain neutral. It immediately became power, and like all power, it concentrated. It did not belong to everyone equally. Some voices mattered more than others. Some words carried weight, while others disappeared. The question was never who speaks the truth. The question became who is allowed to define it. In early human groups, leadership was first demonstrated through action, strength, skill, experience. These were visible. After, language leadership could be demonstrated through interpretation. The leader was no longer just the one who acted best, but the one who explained events most convincingly. This shift was decisive, because explanation shapes memory. Memory shapes belief, and belief shapes obedience. The leader who could turn chaos into narrative gained authority beyond physical dominance. When danger appeared, the leader did not only point or run, they spoke. They named the danger. They framed it. They decided whether it was temporary, controllable, meaningful, or threatening. This framing determined emotional response. If the leader spoke calmly, fear subsided. If the leader amplified threat, fear escalated. The group learned to look to certain voices for emotional regulation. This dependency created hierarchy. Language made leadership psychological, not just physical. Those who controlled narrative controlled fear, and those who controlled fear controlled behavior. This is why speech became selective. Not everyone was allowed to speak freely, not because others had nothing to say, but because uncontrolled speech threatened stability. The group learned quickly that too many interpretations created confusion, so interpretation was centralized. The leader, storyteller, shaman, elder, or priest became the authorized voice. They did not merely describe reality, they translated it into acceptable meaning. This translation filtered truth. It removed uncertainty. It reduced complexity. It preserved order. The narrative did not need to be accurate. It needed to be functional. This functional requirement shaped leadership selection. The most successful leaders were not the most honest. They were the most convincing. They knew how to say just enough truth to remain credible and just enough reassurance to remain trusted. This balance was difficult and powerful. Those who failed to manage it lost authority quickly, not because they lied, but because they destabilized emotion. The group judged leaders not by factual correctness, but by narrative competence. Could they keep fear contained? Could they maintain confidence? Could they preserve cohesion? If yes, they were followed. If no, they were replaced. Language thus created a new elite, not of strength but of interpretation. This elite understood something fundamental. People do not experience reality directly. They experience stories about reality. Once this was understood, control became possible. Leaders learned that repeating a narrative made it feel real. They learned that naming something defined its limits. They learned that silence could erase as effectively as speech. This narrative authority extended beyond immediate danger. It shaped identity. It told the group who they were, where they came from, why they suffered, what they deserved. These stories justified hierarchy. They explained inequality. They framed sacrifice as necessity. Obedience became meaningful, not forced. This was far more effective than coercion. The group did not feel controlled. They felt guided. This guidance required consistency. Narratives had to be protected. Any competing story threatened authority. This is why alternative voices were treated as dangerous even when they were sincere. They fractured narrative unity. The leader could tolerate mistakes but not rival explanations. So dissenting speech was framed as confusion, weakness, or betrayal. The group accepted this framing because it aligned with survival instincts. To question the narrative felt like threatening safety. Language also allowed leaders to project authority into the future. They could promise, they could warn, they could predict. This future-oriented speech increased dependence because the future is uncertain. People seek those who claim to understand it. The leader who spoke confidently about tomorrow gained loyalty today. This loyalty did not depend on outcomes. If predictions failed, they could be reframed. The narrative adapted. Truth did not need to be consistent. It needed to be continuous. This continuity created trust over time. The group remembered the voice more than the facts. This is how narrative outlived accuracy. Children grew up hearing the same explanations. They internalized them before they could question them. Narrative became tradition. Tradition became truth. This process was subtle. It did not feel like manipulation. It felt like inheritance. But inheritance carries power because inherited narratives shape perception before critical thinking develops. This ensured long-term stability of leadership structures. Language also allowed leaders to moralize narrative. Truth is still frightening because it has never stopped being disruptive. No matter how advanced societies become, no matter how much information they accumulate, the psychological cost of truth remains the same. Truth demands change, and change threatens stability. The human mind evolved to prioritize survival, not understanding, and survival favors predictability over accuracy. Truth undermines predictability. It introduces uncertainty. It forces re-evaluation of beliefs, identities, relationships, and systems. This re-evaluation is exhausting. It requires effort, courage, and loss. Humans instinctively avoid loss more than they seek gain. This makes truth emotionally expensive while illusion remains cheap. Truth is frightening because it removes excuses. When a lie exists, responsibility can be displaced. Blame can be redirected. Structures can be justified. When truth appears, responsibility returns to the individual, and responsibility is heavy. It demands action. It demands sacrifice. It demands moral consistency. Most people prefer discomfort they understand over responsibility they cannot escape. Truth is also frightening because it isolates. The moment an individual sees reality differently, they risk separation from the group. And the ancient fear of exclusion has never disappeared. It has simply changed form. Social exile, online ridicule, professional consequences, and loss of belonging trigger the same psychological alarms as physical exile once did. The body reacts before reason can intervene. This makes silence feel safer than honesty. Truth is frightening because it strips identity. Many identities are built on stories that simplify the world. These stories provide meaning, purpose, and belonging. Truth often reveals that these stories are incomplete, exaggerated, or false. When that happens, identity collapses, and identity collapse feels like death. People defend identity even against evidence because losing identity means losing orientation. Truth is frightening because it does not promise comfort, it does not guarantee justice, it does not assure meaning. It often reveals randomness, unfairness, and limitation. This is psychologically intolerable for many. Humans crave narratives that explain suffering. Truth often says suffering has no reason. This emptiness is terrifying. It offers no consolation. Truth is frightening because it has no end point. It does not settle questions permanently. It opens them. Truth does not say this is the answer. It says this is what we know so far. This provisional nature feels unstable. Lies offer closure. Truth offers process, and process feels endless. Truth is frightening because it exposes power. Power survives by controlling interpretation. Truth threatens that control by making structures visible. When people see how systems function, they may question them. This questioning destabilizes hierarchies. So truth is framed as dangerous, divisive, or irresponsible. This framing teaches people to associate truth with harm, even when it is accurate. Truth is frightening because it reveals complicity. Many uncomfortable truths show that harm is not caused by monsters, but by ordinary participation. This realization produces guilt. Guilt is harder to endure than ignorance, so people reject truth not because it is false, but because it implicates them. Truth is frightening because it removes certainty about the future. The more one understands complexity, the less confident predictions become. This uncertainty undermines confidence, and confidence is essential for action. Lies restore confidence by simplifying outcomes. Truth removes it by exposing variables. Truth is frightening because it cannot be controlled. Once spoken, it spreads unpredictably. It interacts with minds differently. It produces unintended consequences. Power fears this unpredictability, so societies learn to manage truth, restrict it, contextualize it, delay it. But even managed truth retains danger because it carries potential awakening. Truth is frightening because it changes relationships. When one person sees what others refuse to see, distance forms. This distance creates loneliness, and loneliness is one of the deepest human fears. Truth is frightening because it demands maturity. It requires tolerating ambiguity, resisting immediate comfort, and acting without guarantees. Most societies do not train these capacities. They train obedience, consumption, and certainty. So truth feels foreign, hostile, and destabilizing. Truth is frightening because it exposes mortality. Lies promise continuity. Truth reminds impermanence. This reminder destabilizes ambition, legacy, and meaning. Truth is frightening because it does not care whether humans are ready. It arrives when it arrives. It remains regardless of acceptance. This indifference mirrors nature itself, and humans have always feared indifference more than hostility. At least hostility acknowledges existence. Truth simply exists. Truth is frightening because it ends the illusion of control. Truth never promised safety. It never promised comfort. It never promised belonging. From the very beginning, truth only promised one thing: clarity, and clarity has always come with a cost. This cost is not paid in pain alone. It is paid in separation, in responsibility, in loss of illusion. Humans did not reject truth because they hated it. They rejected it because they understood it. Truth removes the shelter that stories provide. It dissolves the walls that belief builds. It leaves the individual alone with reality, and reality does not negotiate. For most of history, survival required agreement, not accuracy. Belonging mattered more than understanding. So humanity learned to bend reality into shapeable narratives. These narratives became myths, then morals, then systems. They protected people from fear, but also from awareness. Each era believed it was closer to truth than the last, and each era repeated the same pattern. Accept truth when it serves power, suppress it when it threatens stability, praise it in memory, punish it in the present. This is why truth always arrives too early and is recognized too late. It speaks before people are ready, and when people are ready, it has already been buried. Truth does not shout, it does not persuade, it does not comfort, it waits. And waiting is dangerous in a world built on momentum. Truth asks people to stop, to look, to admit, to change. Most people cannot afford this pause because their identities are in motion. Their lives depend on continuation, not reflection. So truth becomes something admired in theory, but avoided in practice. People say they want truth, but what they mean is reassurance. They want truth that confirms, not truth that confronts. They want answers that preserve meaning, not questions that dissolve it. This is the final contradiction at the center of human history. Humans want truth to be gentle. But truth has never been gentle. It is indifferent. It reveals what is not what should be. Truth does not align with justice. It does not guarantee progress. It does not promise redemption. It simply exposes. Truth does not destroy civilizations. Lies do that slowly, but truth removes the justification for continuing them. This is why it is feared, because once truth is seen, pretending becomes harder, and pretending is what keeps systems alive. The rare individuals who choose truth do not become heroes. They become lonely. They are not celebrated. They are tolerated at best, rejected at worst, because they threaten the unspoken agreement that holds society together. The agreement to look away when looking would cost too much. This video does not ask you to choose truth. It does not ask you to reject comfort. It only asks you to notice the price of both. Comfort offers belonging but demands blindness. Truth offers clarity but demands endurance. There is no moral victory here. There is no clean conclusion. Humanity has always lived between these two poles, and it always will. The question is not whether truth will win. It is whether individuals will learn to sit with it without immediately replacing it with illusion. Truth does not need defenders. It does not need believers. It does not need permission. It only needs space, and space is what humans fear most. Because in silence, without narrative, without reassurance, without direction, we are forced to confront something unbearable, that survival was never meaning, that belonging was never truth, that certainty was always borrowed, and that beneath all stories lies a reality that does not care whether we understand it or not. Truth remains frightening because it has never stopped asking the same question. Are you willing to live without the lies that make you feel safe? And history shows that most people answer no. Not loudly, not defiantly, but quietly, by continuing exactly as before. This is not failure. It is humanity and understanding that may be the closest thing to truth we ever accept. Language did not simply describe reality, it reorganized it. The moment humans began to name things, they began to separate them, and separation created hierarchy. Some things became important, others became irrelevant. Some events became central, others disappeared. Language did not mirror the world, it filtered it, and whatever controls the filter controls perception. This was the beginning of manipulation, not as deception but as selection. To name something was to make it visible. To leave something unnamed was to erase it from collective awareness. Manipulation did not start with lies. It started with emphasis. What is spoken loudly? What is repeated? What is simplified? These choices shape reality more than facts ever could. Language trained the human mind to respond not to what exists, but to what is highlighted. This is why two people can witness the same event and leave with different truths. Their language framed the experience differently. Manipulation lives inside framing, not fabrication. When a leader said this is a threat, the group felt fear. When the same event was framed as a test, the group felt purpose. The event did not change. The language did. And emotion followed language. This is the core mechanism of manipulation. Language binds facts to feelings. Once bound, they are no longer evaluated rationally. They are defended emotionally. This makes manipulation durable because emotions resist correction. Manipulation also relies on simplification. Reality is complex. Language compresses it. This compression is necessary, but it is also dangerous, because what is removed matters as much as what remains. Manipulation thrives in what is omitted, not what is said. By removing context, complexity, and contradiction, language creates certainty. Certainty feels safe. So people prefer simplified narratives even when they are inaccurate. Manipulation also exploits repetition. The human brain equates repetition with reliability. This is not stupidity, it is efficiency. In an uncertain environment, repeated signals are usually important. Manipulators exploit this instinct. By repeating a framed idea, it becomes familiar. Familiarity becomes trust. Trust becomes truth. This process does not require coercion. It requires time. Manipulation also weaponizes ambiguity. Vague language allows multiple interpretations. This flexibility protects the narrative. When challenged, the meaning shifts. When defended, it hardens. This fluidity makes manipulation resilient. Truth is rigid. It breaks under pressure. Manipulated narratives bend. Manipulation also creates false binaries, us and them. Good and evil, safe and dangerous. These binaries simplify decision-making. They reduce moral complexity. They direct loyalty. Binaries are powerful because they remove nuance, and nuance slows action. Manipulation favors speed over accuracy. Language also assigns moral weight. Words like responsibility, freedom, threat, stability are not neutral. They carry emotional charge. Manipulators choose words that activate fear, pride, shame, or hope. These emotions bypass critical thinking. Once activated, they guide behavior automatically. This is why manipulation often feels like common sense rather than persuasion. It aligns with emotional reflexes. Manipulation also redefines truth itself. Truth becomes what is authorized, what is validated by authority, consensus, or repetition. This externalization removes personal responsibility for judgment. People stop asking, "Is this true?" They ask, "Is this accepted?" This shift allows manipulation to scale. Once acceptance replaces verification, power no longer needs to convince individuals. It only needs to maintain consensus. Language also shapes memory. The past is not remembered as it happened, but as it was narrated. Manipulated narratives rewrite history not by changing facts, but by changing emphasis. Heroes are elevated, failures are minimized, causes are simplified. This curated memory shapes identity. Identity then defends the narrative. This feedback loop is powerful because attacking the narrative feels like attacking the self. Manipulation becomes self-sustaining. Language also trains silence. What cannot be said cannot be thought. When certain phrases trigger punishment, ridicule, or exclusion, people avoid them. This avoidance creates blind spots. These blind spots become normal. They are not experienced as censorship, but as absence. Manipulation thrives in absence. Language also creates legitimacy by using formal tones, expert vocabulary, and institutional framing. Manipulated narratives gain authority. They sound objective even when they are selective. This aesthetic of truth replaces truth itself. People trust form over substance. Manipulation also benefits from fatigue. When people are tired, overwhelmed, or stressed, they rely on linguistic shortcuts. They accept headlines, slogans, and summaries. Manipulation exploits this cognitive economy. It packages meaning in easily digestible forms. Truth rarely fits this format. Manipulation also reframes resistance. Questioning becomes negativity. Skepticism becomes cynicism. If you are still here, it means something resisted being ignored. This video was not made to give answers. It was made to leave you with questions that do not disappear when the screen goes dark. Most people close videos to escape thought. This one was meant to follow you after it ends. If at any moment you felt discomfort, confusion, or silence, that is not a flaw, it is the point. Truth never arrives as relief. It arrives as weight, and weight changes how you stand, how you look, and how you move through the world. This channel exists for people who are willing to carry that weight, not loudly, not heroically, but honestly. History is not a story of progress. It is a story of avoidance of truth, delayed until consequences become unavoidable. Fear, belief, power, language, and comfort have shaped the world you live in more than facts ever did, and understanding that does not make life easier, it makes it clearer. If you are looking for certainty, this is not the place. If you are looking for comfort, this is not the place. But if you are willing to question the stories you inherited, the beliefs you repeat, and the narratives you live inside, then you already belong here. Subscribe not because you agree with what you heard, but because you are willing to sit with it, because thinking alone is difficult, and silence is heavy, but it is where real understanding begins. This channel will not tell you what to believe. It will ask you why you believe what you do, and that question is more dangerous than any answer. Subscribe and stay if you are not afraid of doubt, if you are not afraid of seeing history without decoration, and if you are not afraid of truth that does not ask for your permission. We will keep walking into the parts of history and the mind that most people turn away from. And if you are still listening, that means you are already walking with us.